Yeah. Hi, welcome back to the main stage for our panel discussion, which is going to cover several components that end up silencing what we need to hear or know about violence against Indigenous people. My name is Kim Slade, and I'll be your moderator again during this session. It is my honor to introduce our two panelists. Suzanne Smoke is originally from Alderville First Nation, currently working in community outreach and engagement, anti-human trafficking for Muskoka Parry Sound Sexual Assault Services. Suzanne is also the interim director and mental health coordinator for the Taibu Indigenous Mental Wellness Committee, combining a holistic approach to sexual assault and domestic violence, Indigenous mental health and trauma, and helps navigate and advocate through multifaceted healthcare systems. Next, we have Robin Rice. She is a proud mother to a teenage daughter who is mixed with Indigenous, Jamaican, Arawak, and First Nations. She is the creator and coordinator of the Wingush Youth Mentorship Program under the umbrella of Kids with Incarcerated Parents. She is very eager and excited to work with the Anishinaabe Wellness Collective to continue to make change within ourselves and our community. Welcome, Robin and Suzanne. It's a privilege to have you both with us here this morning.
I'm honored to be sitting here on this panel with my sister Robin to speak to our communities from all the four directions and really shed some light on the colonial violence and trauma that we as Indigenous women and all of our relatives, our Two-Spirit, all of our relatives and our families are facing a collective grief and trauma through the intergenerational effects of residential school. And I would like to also acknowledge the children, the Indigenous children across Canada. Many of you have heard of the 215 graves that were found in Kamloops. We know that I believe our numbers are at over almost 10,000 at this time, and there are still many more schools and places to search for. So our prayers are always with the families and with the children and the lost souls that didn't get to come home. And I use the words graves, but I really want to caution that those were not graves because that implies a memorial or a marker or that we knew of. These were large pits in the ground where our children have been found and hidden for many years. So I want to acknowledge those families, and we start there with that colonial violence and trauma against our children as Indigenous people. So I'll let Robin introduce herself and we'll continue.
Ani bojo, wabishkizi migwan kwe, pichi manomini, mang indodam, nigig indodam, Wasaskan First Nations, Turtle Island, Toronto, Indigenous. I said my name is Robin Rice. My spirit name is White Feathered Woman, Wabishkizi Migwankwe. I come from the Loon and Otter clan. The Loon adopted me and the Otter took over in my 30s. I'm a single mother to a 16-year-old and I'm a student, as well as I was born and raised in Toronto, but my family resides back home on Parry Sound, Parry Island, which is Wasaukston First Nations. Chimigwech.
So I think it's very important as we talk about gender-based violence, as we talk about violence against our relatives, that we understand the before. How did we get here? Many agencies, many non-Indigenous support agencies really do not have knowledge and understanding to move forward in healing wisdom. We are healing from Western society. We are healing from colonial trauma. And if these support agencies in all facets do not understand the before, if they carry bias or unconscious bias, if they learned their history from a white-centered lens, then really not understanding the full impact of colonial violence against Indigenous people. So I'm going to start in the beginning for us as Indigenous people, violence against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit and all of our relatives. I just really want to share with everyone that for us, we are not victims of our own demise. We did not get here on our own. That colonial violence is imparted on bodies that are deemed less than. And we as Indigenous have been deemed less than since the beginning of settler colonialism in 1492. I'm just trying to, it is not letting me, there we go. So again, a bit of my background. I'm Ginukwe, Golden Eagle Woman. I sit with the Bear Clan, which is a medicine clan and a protection clan. I'm from Alderville First Nation. My first and most important role in my life is I am a mother and life giver, as is Robin. We both are raising beautiful, wonderful, magnificent daughters. Unfortunately, they are 12 times more likely to become a victim of violence within their own treaty territories, within our own cities here. Robin sits in Toronto. I sit just north of Toronto, and understanding that as mothers, we are fearful every day that our daughters have a target on their backs because they have brown skin, because they are obstacles to the land and the water of the settler nation. I currently work for Muskoka Parry Sound Sexual Assault Services. I work in anti-human trafficking, understanding that for anti-human trafficking, Indigenous women and girls make up 51% of all traffic survivors, yet we only make up 2% of the population. So that tells me and identifies barriers and obstacles and gaps in services, and also lack of access to healthcare and services for Indigenous women reaching out for help. We also make up 52% of all incarcerated people in our systems, in our jail systems. Indigenous women make up 52% of all incarcerated, yet again, only less than 2% of the population. So again, glaring gaps in services, and how are we healing our nations? I am the interim director of the Indigenous Mental Wellness Council, serving the GTA, working with Indigenous youth and families during COVID crisis. So we do food boxes, we do rent supports, housing, but mental health strategies, and many of us are working in the frontline crisis strategies now, engaging with mental health and wellness on the streets. So I am a pipe carrier, women's traditional dancer. I use my role in ceremony to help heal our nations. And I believe it's through traditional Anishinaabe healing methods that we're going to heal our nations from the colonial violence that we've suffered. So there is a trigger warning, and Kim was kind enough to add a trigger warning in the beginning. Sometimes when I do these presentations, it is to residential school survivors or to the children of, and really understanding when we speak about residential school, when we speak about what was happening there and the level of abuse. I really want people to be prepared that this is what we will be speaking about. And also when I speak about the residential school, I want to speak about people's belief systems. And I believe that everyone has their faith in whatever their great mystery is, whatever their belief system is. I have a great respect for each and every one of you, and the direction in which you come and the belief system in which you hold, really understanding that what happened in residential schools was the messengers and the misguided efforts of those that were in those places at that time. I have a great respect for the healing that comes for many in all the forms that they choose. So again, the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women is an ongoing, painful legacy for the Indigenous community that needs resolution in order for us to be able to move forward with a better relationship in this country. Those families that have lost women to violence need to have some answers, because they will be unwilling to engage in dialogues around reconciliation until that issue is addressed. These families are hurting, and because they're hurting, other people around them are going to be hurting. And the Canadian public, I think, should feel that they're hurting as well. We should be standing up with them and saying, we need to know what happened, and we need to make sure this never happens again. And of course, many of you may be familiar with Senator Murray Sinclair. He is the former chair from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are over 98 recommendations that every Canadian should be familiar with and take action to reconcile with us as First Nations people. We have done nothing wrong. Understanding that our culture, our language, as Robin and I open, I'm carrying my Eagle bundle, we're speaking in our language. We could have been thrown in jail for that. When we look at the history of Canada and a foreign settler government coming in and telling us we can no longer speak the sovereign language of our traditional territory. Understanding before settlers even came to our shores, they negated who we are. They negated our very existence if we did not have Christ in our lives. And how could we have Christ in our lives if that is not our belief system and we had no knowledge of? But really understanding that the doctrine of discovery gave full permission to cleanse the land of Indigenous peoples. We were likened to the flora and fauna. We were not even considered human beings if we had not accepted Christ into our lives. And again, this was in regards to the land. It was in regards to taking possession of and removing the obstacles to the land and the water, which is Indigenous people, and specifically Indigenous women and girls. When we look at colonial legislation that was imparted on our bodies as Indigenous people, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, this was historical records of diseases. And this is really important right now, especially as we look at this big, great sickness that's all across the world. This is a time that our prophecies have told us, and all of our prophecies through the Indigenous elders are true and have come true. Violence and depopulation of the Americas during the influenza and smallpox epidemics in 1493 to 1520. Really understanding the smallpox epidemic was the first germ warfare used by Canada against Indigenous people, that they purposely infected the smallpox blankets, took them from those that had died of smallpox, and distributed those to First Nations communities across Canada, thus the first germ warfare. So that's a really horrific beginning to a relationship that was supposed to be built on friendship and mutual understanding and respect. Very quickly became one of power and oppression and genocide and assimilation of Indigenous peoples. This triggered successive epidemics until at least the 19th century. British colonial law without input, consult, or consent of Indigenous peoples, and we became subjects of the Crown and technically under protection of the Crown. And I can say that under the Crown, as settlers, being under protection of, considering we have the highest in violence rates, highest in incarceration, highest in lack of services, scraping the bottom of the barrel, begging for crumbs. There is no protection level for Indigenous people. And in fact, Indigenous women and girls, there is a very controlled effort to not protect Indigenous women and girls across this country. So the impact on Indigenous women and Two-Spirit within our community is waves of trauma and grief that have not been resolved within the Aboriginal psyche and have become deeply embedded in the collective memory of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous women became the property of men. Treaty negotiations between the British and only Indigenous men. Indigenous female leadership was not valued or legitimized, and it displaced women from their leadership roles of negotiation and spokesperson roles within our communities. Really understanding at this time that in our communities, it's our clan mothers, it's our grandmothers, it's our kokums, and they're the ones that prepare us and prepare all those next generations for the future survival of our communities. Really understanding that taking the women out of those leadership roles, that's a form of that colonial violence that has impacted brown bodies. The Gradual Civilization Act, 1857, the Enfranchisement Act, 1869, again, looking at foreign colonial legislation meant to eradicate, assimilate, and get rid of Indigenous people on the land. This is your Canada, unfortunately, and this is our lived experience as Indigenous people. Assimilation efforts, military allies elevating the status of male warriors and leaders, policies that supported the eradication of the Indian problem, becoming subjects of the Crown, and to establish legitimate land claim of the territory for British expansion. That is key to the violence imparted against our bodies. Indigenous women cannot be civilized as they are considered property of their fathers and their husbands. Men who learned English no longer were considered Indigenous, and they lost their status, and they had to remove their property, which was their wife and children, from the reserves. Males, wife, and children had no rights to land or monies he was allocated. All descendants of enfranchised natives had to follow the father's lineage, thus negating any further status Indians. Right now, according to the Indian Act, the last status Indian will be in 2034. And it was Canada was one of the last countries to sign the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, because they don't have very much longer to wait for us to be no longer considered status, again, according to legislation imparted by a foreign settler government. So again, it's attacking the identity, the very existence of who we are as Indigenous people. So the Indian Act, still in existence today, very much racist, very archaic. Since 1867, the goal of the act was to assimilate by means of a series of laws, as we've discussed, that determined who is Indigenous, governance, what legal activities natives could partake in, and penalties for illegal activity. Hierarchical male privilege and violence against women was normalized. So really understanding the series of laws, we were not allowed to gather in more than groups of 3. In some laws, we were not allowed to dance. So really understanding our healing that we get from the traditional dance, from our cultures and our ceremonies, those were outlawed. Carrying my bundle was outlawed. Dancing was outlawed. Speaking our language was outlawed. Our very identity was outlawed according to the Indian Act, and still in existence today. We are under the Indian Act. In order to qualify as a status Native, one had to be male or married to a male or a child of. Indigenous women could not vote nor run for leadership roles. A sexual deviancy reporting process for Indigenous women who had children out of wedlock or left their husbands. An Indigenous woman's status or identity was tied to her father's reserve and then transferred to the husband's. Men held exclusive on reserve property rights. Indigenous women could hold no property. An Indigenous woman loses her status and identity as Indigenous if she marries anyone not status, and she would be forcibly removed from the reserve as well as her children. So when we look at the date of the Indian Act 1876, really understanding that this is still in play today. We as Indigenous women just protected a young woman, mother who had lived in a community, married to a First Nations gentleman in his reserve, ran her business, had her home, had their children who were now grown, living in the community. That marriage ended, and within 30 days, well, actually within a week, she was given an eviction notice and 30 days to remove her belongings, which was her children, not their children, her children, from the reserve. And she had no marital support, no half and half. She doesn't get to take anything with her. She left with nothing after 30 years, left the marital home, left the business, and had to be forcibly removed by chief and council and the police, enacting the Indian Act of removing her from the community. This is only a couple of years ago here in our territories. So really understanding the impact on Indigenous women. When we remove the men from our communities, it will suffer greatly. When we remove the women from our communities, it will cease to exist. So understanding that this is a controlled legislation to impart violence against Indigenous women, to remove us from our communities, therefore they will no longer exist, thus opening up the land, and really understanding that the Indian Act still in existence today. There have been some minor changes to the Matrimonial Act, but very much so Indigenous women leave with nothing. So understanding the vulnerability of that. And I can say that it is through the help and support of people like Ellen Campbell at Abuse Hurts that have helped me for many years, helping the women in our communities who are displaced due to this colonial violence. So this is our Indigenous women, as magnificent as they are. The first economic drivers within our communities is our basket making and weaving, arts from the land. This was our first economic driver because Indigenous women were displaced. There was no economy. There was no means of support for them, and they began their own economy, thus creating dissension amongst the family structure and that sacred family hoop that was already being broken by that colonial influence. Understanding violence against Indigenous women through the eugenics movement, weeding out undesirables, medical sterilization, most often done without consent. Indigenous women were targets for forced sterilization. Again, this is not in your history. This is still happening today. We are having many women coming forward through Winnipeg, through many of the Western provinces that are still being sterilized without consent. They're being targeted as Indigenous women with brown skin. There are also still birth alerts that are happening. I just dealt with a client and her family. There was a birth alert placed even though they are supposed to be illegal. Many First Nations people, there are many people that are very biased, that think that they still know how to raise Indigenous children better than us as Indigenous women and families. And the birth alerts are still in place, and Indigenous children are being taken at an alarming rate. And really understanding that we are at a higher rate of apprehension through CAS and social services than we were through the residential school systems. So there's something wrong with that system, and we need to look at that as well. So the impacts on Indigenous women in Two-Spirit, Indigenous women who had children out of wedlock were deemed mentally defected and sterilized. Sexual deviancy reporting programs implemented by government to target Indigenous women, those that refused treatment were sterilized. Indigenous girls in residential school would be sterilized before release. And in 1937, the Sexual Sterilization Act was amended to include individuals incapable of intelligent parenthood, specifically targeting Indigenous women, thus taking the children. We take the women, now we take the children, because those are our future generations in our communities. So the residential school, and I'm going to wrap this up really quick, Robin, removing Indigenous children from the influences of culture, community, and family from the age of 18 months to 16 years. Kill the Indian, save the child, which is very much the words of Sir Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs in that time. These are extreme forms of violence, sexual predation, child labor, and medical experimentation, and really understanding that the residential school is the largest pedophiliac ring across Canada, and the impacts of that violence and trauma is very much the symptoms that we see now within our First Nations communities. That colonial trauma and violence has impacted the children and grandchildren. And those are, you know, the last school closed in 1996. This is not the history books. This is still very much prevalent. This is our aunties, our uncles, our grandparents, our brothers, our sisters. My daughter Cedar, Ogama Gishko, she was born in 1999. You know, she could have been a residential school survivor. She could have been lost to this residential school experience. Many of you that have tuned in, Ellen and our family at Abuse Hurts, many of them know my daughter Cedar. And I get choked up every time I look at that number of 1996. And I think Canadians collectively should be horrified that this continued as long as it did. And it was very, I think that many Canadians were duped about what was happening in our communities, and really understanding that this is 3 and 4 generations of Indigenous children growing up in widespread trauma, violence, physical and sexual abuse. Religion was indoctrinated, loss of culture, language, and ceremony. So indoctrination was aimed at destroying and disrupting traditional roles and preparing young girls to be good Christian wives. Indigenous women are taught that their bodies are sinful and dirty. They also taught Canadians the same thing, that we are less than, that our bodies are deemed less than. And again, that colonial violence against brown bodies is imparted when we are dehumanized and devalued as a whole nation. So this is one section of photos, understanding that there were over 150,000 children, Indigenous children, taken from their homes and families. We know that the mortality rate within these schools was over 50%. So as much as we hear about 215 children in Kamloops, as much as we know that some of the survivors made it home, understanding the impact and the loss, that we believe there are over 70,000 plus children that were murdered and missing during the residential school era that never found their way home. That is horrifying, that collective grief that we all carry in our communities, and the survivors that we pray, sing, and try and heal every day from this trauma. Those are our family members. Those are people within our communities. Every Indigenous family has been affected by the residential school trauma here in Canada. So what do we have? What are we working towards? And I'm going to end it with this slide, Robin, and then we'll move forward. So this, what did we have before colonization? And I really want to pinpoint this medicine wheel with the 4 colors. For us, the 4 colors represent a number of things. They represent healing, they represent balance, they represent the 4 colors of man coming together in balance, friendship, and equality. What we had before, women had the respected role as she was the backbone to family, community, and nation. The spiritual foundation was core to Native beliefs. Strong, healthy families, children, elders, men and women, all with respected roles. Balanced roles of men and women, respected roles of women as life givers, main teachers, and preparing our youth for future survival of the people. So really understanding, since contact, the residential schools destroyed our families. They destroyed our spiritual beliefs, tried to destroy our spiritual beliefs. We are resilient, we are strong, we are magnificent, we still speak our language, we still have our ceremonies. We were denied our language and culture, loss of respect for women, denied our traditional lifestyles, disruption of spiritual foundation, denied our traditional roles, European values focused on male-dominated society through religion and through governments. So what we see now in our communities, and many Canadians absolve themselves of any responsibility or wrongdoing and look at Indigenous people, and we hear the stereotypes of lazy, drunken, burdens on society, even the language and media, plagues to society, disease-ridden, plague-filled. The description of Indigenous people already deems us less than. It already looks at us as devalued, as dehumanized, that we are victims of our own demise, really understanding that that colonial trauma has been imparted since contact. Family breakdowns, family violence, high suicide rates, denied traditional roles, denied our language and culture, the sexual abuse, the low self-esteem, the spiritual foundation is broken. And I can tell you that we as Indigenous people have a connection to Creator. Everything has spirit. Our prayers, every day we give thanks and gratitude. We thank Spirit for everything that is all around us. Everything we need to survive, Creator has put here for us. We are the most spiritual people as Indigenous, and we have to hit reset on this relationship, and really understanding our connection to Creator is what heals our generations. Our spiritual foundation was broken. Legislation and government policies enforced male-dominated values and breakdown of Native family structures. The Indian Act destroyed the traditional structures, spiritual family structure, and survival off the land, which is key. So where are we moving to? Robin and I are working at decolonizing at a fast rate. All of our youth, our children, and our families. We are recognized as life givers, main teachers in preparing youth for the future survival of our people. We carry the spiritual foundation, which is core to our belief systems. The children, elder, men, and women, we all have respected roles, balanced roles of men and women, and strong, healthy families, and elimination of family violence. So I'm going to stop that right there, and just really understanding, and that's just a brief synopsis of some of the legislation that was imparted on us as brown bodies, and really understanding that this was done through a series of legislation that imparted this violence, and very much is encouraged and still at play today in legislation through the federal governments. We as Indigenous people are taking control back of our families and communities and the healing that needs to happen. So I know that was a lot of information in a short time. So I will turn it over to Robin for her lived experience. And she is also a knowledge keeper and life giver. So take it away, Robin.
Oh, Chimigwech. I always enjoy, well, not enjoy, I always like hearing the knowledge so that we could, the truth of the history that wasn't there and being told before lived experiences come in. I have my eagle feather that was gifted to me from Suzanne Smoke a long time ago, and it was a feather that represented the truth that came out of my story the first time I shared my story. So I'm going to start off with a poem, and then I'll give you everybody a brief description. But when you really listen to a poem, this is a poem about my life and about who I am and who I created to be. This woman used to scare me. She hid in a glass house to keep herself protected. This woman here was lost. She had fought so many battles that are still hidden deep down. She keeps it locked up. This woman here has faced her greatest fears. At times, she thought she'd never make it out alive. This woman here was never afraid to die. She still holds on to the pain of what was done to her while trying to stay alive. This woman here hurt people while drowning in her own pain and sorrows. This woman here thought the world was damn right cold. She was scared to tell people what had happened to her, while others shut her down, called her names, and didn't believe in her. This woman here is still scared of the past that sits heavy on her heart. She sometimes continues to blame herself. This woman here felt the sickness of her blood memory line without the knowledge of the true history of what had really happened in the past. This woman seen things with her own two eyes that she had wished she hadn't. This woman here fought so hard to find who she really is. This woman was scared. This woman right here reclaimed her identity, her story. Now she shares. This woman here is glad to be alive. She is blessed to help heal with our people. This woman right here continues to stay strong, rise up, share her experiences. This woman continues to show strength. She has grown from her weaknesses. This woman here knows how to feel her emotions. She knows how to voice her words loud and proud. Finally, this woman has no more fear. This woman right here is who I compete with daily, so I can become greater, wiser, and continue to be braver than I was yesterday. This woman right here stands strong, loud, and Indigenous, proud. This woman is a mother, a daughter, granddaughter, niece. She is her own creator. This woman right here is a light that continues to fight for a better life. This woman right here is medicine. This woman right here is filled with gratitude. This woman right here is a warrior, a survivor. This woman is Wabishkizi Migwankwe, Robin Rice, Pichi Monomini. This woman is me. I actually wrote that poem when I started opening up with my story. My poems used to be very dark. They used to talk about abuses. People wouldn't be able to look at my poems without being very, very triggered. When I started opening up with my stories, and that's when this truth started coming out. I am a product of residential schools. I'm an intergenerational trauma survivor and a product of the children's aid system here in Toronto. I was in the children's aid system at a very early age. I was also abused at an early age, and that abuse that took place as a child, I shut my mouth. I wasn't happy no more. I lost my innocence. I lost who I was. I lost trust in people around me. I lost that trust. I wouldn't use my voice no more. When my mom asked me about the abuses, I wouldn't talk about it. I would just shut my mouth and hide under a table. She found me hidden under a table the first time. I ended up telling her when I was about in my 20s, you know, and I'm 36 right now. And then I live in a long line of seeing abuses, but also having dreams of the abuses that happened to my family and the history of Parry Sound. I had never lived up there, but I dreamt about what happened, and it left me scared. It left me scared to trust myself with people, with males, not even males, even with females. I didn't trust nobody. And then I reached up to the age of 14, 15. When I was in my group home, I ended up getting beat up really badly going to a wedding, and I got left in between two houses. And I don't even remember how I was found. I don't remember who found me. I don't remember what happened. All I know is that I was naked, beat up, and I was just there, and I went along with my day as if nothing happened. But that was my way of sucking things inside of my stomach. I remember going away to a treatment center at the age of 15 again, and I ended up getting left at somebody's house, and I got raped and beat up, and this person was on top of me. I ended up going to my reserve, and I was getting sent away to treatment center because I was a runaway. I'm sharing these stories because that's when the abuses first happened. This is when my voice got locked. I had a lump there like a frog. I couldn't use my voice at all. I went to doctors all the time because they always thought I had an STD, because they classified me as a prostitute at the age of 12. On my records, when I get my CAS record back, my children's aid files back, it's gonna have so much pain and hurt because of what the police at 11 Division, and I will call that out, as much as I got saved by certain people, I was also dragged down by the words of people who were supposed to help me, move forward. The people in some of my group homes didn't give a shit about me. And I'm sorry to be so blunt, but they didn't. And it left me further and further back into one of these women, young girls, who didn't want to tell anybody about these abuses. I had my daughter at the age of 20. My husband and my daughter left. Before then, I was in a bunch of gang violence and stuff like that, and the story could go on, but I had my daughter, and she went to Jamaica with her father. You know, I was depressed, and what did I do? I went back into my drinking. I went because I was so hurt, but that drinking took over. And that's what happens. It's that trauma that I couldn't deal with. And when that happened, because I was in an abusive relationship, it ended up taking me on a different path again. When I lost my daughter, and I mean not lose her, but I lost her as in that connection by her going to Jamaica. And I lost my husband at that time, going to Jamaica, getting deported. I ended up not caring. And all that trauma when I was younger came back and bit me in the butt, and I didn't understand why. But I continued my life, and then I met this guy who I thought was in love with me and treated me like he helped me stop drinking, but yet he wanted me to go into escorting. And I had already got myself out of that on my own. I was involved in it myself. Nobody was doing it to force me. I did it myself to survive. It was my way of survival. I didn't understand the words of survival when I became a survivor. I didn't understand that my grandparents, my ancestors were guiding me out of situations. I don't know how I made it out alive in some of these situations. I really don't. I really don't. I've had so much trauma to my head as well because of these abuses. And I'm fortunate to share my story because a lot of our sisters are not able to share our story. They're not able to share their story. I raised my daughter really strong. I've been sharing, not my abuses, but I've been sharing how to protect herself at a very young age, very young. Me and her dad, we've been both acknowledging that stuff happens that isn't us, isn't ours to carry. And I've been teaching her and I've been raising her to be amazing. When I went back into my culture when I was about 30, I left my culture for a very long time. And the reason why I left was because I was ashamed. I was ashamed myself to be Indigenous. Even though all my friends who are non-Indigenous were like, oh, cool, you're Indigenous, they didn't have those stereotypical ways because we were those little misfits that came together and created our own family. So they accepted me for who I was. But when I went outside in the real world, I was that drunken little girl. I was that runaway. I was that prostitute by the cops, by my people who took care of me in group homes. You know, I used to get sent to a place in Toronto, and it was known for girls who were on the streets, but in that phase where the police want to say prostitution. All I was doing was running away. However, a lot of men took advantage of that. A lot of older men took advantage of that. A lot of men took advantage of grooming me. And I say men because that was the ones who did it to me. That was who groomed me when I was a little girl. I didn't realize that people were calling me Pocahontas because they wanted to poke my hauntus, but they had a description of me as a fantasizing as Pocahontas. And I was wondering, I'd never felt right on this for a long time, you know, and it was scary because when I started realizing what Pocahontas and the story meant, Pocahontas was a lot of our sisters. Pocahontas is our sister, our ancestor, you know, and her story needs to be told. And so I sit here sharing my truth, my knowledge, sharing what I've been through because lived experiences are so important. We don't hear them enough. And when we do, we get shut down quickly. Or when people want us to share our stories, we're not acknowledged in the way that we're supposed to. It's like we're tokenized. I won't be your tokenized Indian. However, I will be my own Indigenous woman to stand up for what I believe and share my story and share the story that I can create with my own creation story. We have our own creation story. And my story was for me to be in the stuff that I was supposed to be in, not saying it has to be on anyone else. But the reason why I was protected and guided to this journey, to where I am as a 36-year-old, someone who came as a jingle dress dancer, a jingle dress of healing. You know how exciting that is? Like I'm taking on a lead of head dancer soon, next week. I've never thought I'd be here. As a little girl, I would dance around with no regalia. And my cousin would always give me hers to wear. And I thought that was beautiful. So I feel like I've done a circle, and I always talk about this circle all the time because no one's above, no one's below. We all sit on that circle where we see each other, we acknowledge each other, we share our stories, we help each other heal as a community, as a family, bring it back to what we were supposed to be doing before the British soldiers came. And I bring that up because I talk about a story with my youth. It's a calm story, but it's a true story about one of the first murdered missing Indigenous women here in Toronto, who was murdered by a British soldier because she wouldn't give sexual favors for alcohol. So I think those stories need to continue happening about the truth of what happened with our Toronto purchase and bring it into our now times. I stand here proud in my ceremony with our teachers. I stand here proud going to school. Even though I don't agree with Western views, I want my education, because with my education, I could be the most powerful Indigenous person, because Westernizing ways want us to not have that education. However, I just don't agree that I have to educate myself on my own knowledge, on my own history. And so I sit here today as a survivor to share this story. And I could have went deeper, but because we don't have a lot of time, I could only give little bits and pieces. But I will be creating a storybook, and I will be creating a poem book, because I do write a lot of stories that have that personal knowledge with the personal teachings inside of them that I know for a fact will help other people. And I encourage all the survivors to reach out to other survivors that have been giving these teachings. Please reach out, because this is what we're there for. We're there to help, heal, encourage, and grow together, teach each other, but also stand beside each other and hold each other up. As Suzanne always says, we need to sister up, because that's what we need to do. Chimigwech.
Chimigwech. Kim, are we doing question and answer now, or do we still have a couple minutes to wrap up?
You have about 3 minutes. So
Okay.
if there haven't been any questions yet, but if someone has a question, you can put it in the chat at the bottom of the video.
So one thing, and as Robin was speaking, she talked about that 12-year-old that was identified as a sex trade worker. I work in anti-human trafficking. I can tell you that many young Indigenous runaways are deemed sex trade workers when they're being exploited, when they're being groomed, when they're being assaulted. They're being identified. I can tell you that anyone under the age of 16, that is rape. That is sexual assault. There is no 12-year-old child selling sex. And if we look at Tina Fontaine, who was 14 years old, who reached out to police, who reached out to agencies, who reached out to shelters and supported, they all failed her. And we found her in the Red River. She was 14 years old, and they described her as her drug-addled sex trade worker. She was a 14-year-old girl fleeing from violence, looking for supports, and was turned away at every avenue. So I think that's really key, that we have to identify our misconceptions and reevaluate what we've been taught about Indigenous people as agencies. I'm going to end with this poem, and this is called We Will Begin Again. I wanted to find a way to tell you how to empower women, how to understand what an empowered woman looks like. The most powerful woman that came to mind had long black hair, wore buckskin hide, and carried the message of the sacred pipe. When I look around the room, I already know many of you do not understand who that woman may be. The image that is stained in your brain, designed to maintain a colonial image, you may think and see a different kind of lady. The image that may surface may be one of someone who is wearing a crown, jewels sparkling, diamond, rubies, and gold-plated wrists, feet, and fingers. When she walks into the room, rose petals fall before each step, butterflies dance around her. When she leaves the room, the scent of beauty lingers. So it is a princess who stands before you, and the Disney details, dress, shoes, and crown, pause. Let that sink in. No, switch up the idea and let's begin again. Disney never understood a crown or what it means now to be solid, to be strong, to sing our song from our souls and our ancestors' long braids to the depths of our wombs. We will begin again. Let's change the perception from what we thought a true female heiress is about and how she behaves. I know one thing for sure is my grandmothers, my ancestors, the buffalo hunters and counting coup hitters would turn over in their graves if I carried that image sane. We have to take into consideration that our little girls look up to Pocahontas, Tiger Lily, and Disney eats that right up. They want our little girls to walk around ignorant of history, proud to be silent, well-behaved and destined to wait for a prince to find and fall in love. While I am not the Indian princess your childhood stories told you about, don't tell me to be submissive and silent. My power cannot survive in doubt. As a woman who has to speak to you in the same tongue her ancestors were spoken to while being raped, I now speak to you in the same tongue, but it is not forked, it is empowered. And I use it to state the same claim to understand my new saying, which is to remain the same Indian professional woman on her A game, educated and creating a powerful legacy with my same last name they gave me. Take me, I say, take me, and use me to empower my people. Empower them powerfully, no matter how powerful the choir sings at the church steeple. I will sing with them as long as we are singing a song of learning to understand the power of resilience. Within, we will begin again. Wearing my quill work and ribbon skirts, best believe I will come for you and I will take my sisters back and still short first. I am not a victim. I am a powerful heart beating loud like a drum being hit at the ceremony. I stand before you ready to fight, ready for battle with pen in hand and sweetgrass in the other. I am here to free myself, to empower my sisters and my brothers. My self-determination cannot be determined by any sort of false idea of authority. The blood that runs through my veins helps me and speaks through me. I am a resilient woman sent by my ancestors, Nakota, Sioux, Haudenosaunee, and Plains Cree. I come to you as a humbled servant, prepared to love and speak or do whatever Creator intended for me to do here with my degree and my spirituality. I know the problem in front of me is never as big as the power behind me, and we will begin again. Miigwech, and that is from Talatatusis, who is a sexual assault survivor, who is a recovered meth addict, who now is a social worker, who now works at empowering First Nations women. So I say Chimigwech to Kim, Robin, powerful always, and to our community members, Chimigwech.
Robin and Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing your stories and information today. I know Suzanne and I talked a couple of times before today, and it's great to be able to hear your story and learn more. I want to thank you for sharing with us this morning, and that you were able to tell your story. And Robin, to you in particular, never apologize for being blunt. I think that as a Canadian who's a fourth generation Canadian, my family arrived in the 1800s, we need to hear the blunt story and we need to hear the truth. So please don't apologize for that. We're going to go into a break now, and then we will be coming back to sessions at 11 o'clock. So please join us in those sessions. All right. Thank you, Suzanne and Robin. We'll see you in the conference.
Bamapi.